Um, so I wanted to discuss some of the themes in Awakening to a New Story, the most recent talk that you've done, because I feel like where I'm at in my researches and stuff is I think I'm perceiving the same problems that you're speaking about, and would like to just discuss them and get a clearer sense of. I just have a discussion around them really. The main problem I see you pointing to, having watched it and made some notes on it, is what Max Weber called disenchantment. The disenchantment of the modern world, or the language you use is desouling, whereby Christian theology and modern materialist science have led to a world where the soul of things, the enchantment of things, has left in some way. And so I think I share that perception with you, and I'd like to have a discussion today about potential solutions to that, how you see us moving forward into a new story, as you say, and kind of how that might be brought about. So I suppose we could start with how you think it is that we've come to this. I know that I want to be sensitive because I think you've explained it so beautifully and thoroughly in those talks, but perhaps for the audience of this YouTube channel and for people who might not be familiar with the talks, it'd be great to understand how you think.
Okay, well, I came to it a long lifetime of trying to find out what was wrong, sort of thing, ever since I was at Oxford University, where there was something called logical positivism, which was the philosophy of the day. And as I studied more and more, I could see that something went very wrong in Christianity, terribly wrong, because what happened was the Christian church got a huge inflation. It became inflated with its own power, thinking that it was the answer for humanity, thinking that if it destroyed all other creeds and all other beliefs and it stayed supreme, everything would be fine. I've just been doing a lot of work with indigenous people, and what they suffered at the hands of the Christian church is utterly appalling, or at the hands of Christians. So that is a whole category of wounds or traumas that need to be healed, the indigenous thing. Then the other thing was the black people, of course, with the slavery in Africa. But all of these things Christians should have known if they'd followed the teaching of Christ. So they did not follow it, and they became enmeshed in the teaching of the church, which was quite different from the teaching of Christ. And so they had to believe in the church rather than discover their own path, really, to living the teaching of Christ and becoming Christ themselves, becoming people who were highly developed and conscious, if you like. So that is my general feeling, and I feel more and more strongly about this. And even now, I wish there could be a great mass for the souls of all the people who've been murdered by the church, and or who've been had their children taken away from them to be re-educated in the Christian church, or any number of absolutely terrible wounds that have been inflicted on people. So this has sort of come together really in that talk, although I didn't speak so passionately as I'm doing now, because I wanted to be measured and explain things going along. But what happened was that also the church, all the Christian churches, and including the Muslim religion and the Jewish religion, they all repressed animism, that is to say, the contact that people had with nature. they wiped out with very severe penalties any sign that people were talking to animals or talking to plants or listening to the particular messages coming from the cosmos. And they obviously put away all the sacred places that they could and built churches instead, often on the places. So they wiped out the old culture, the old shamanic cultures. And that was what I said in the beginning of that talk, more in the SMN talk than the other one, that they were all, these early cultures were shamanic cultures guided by shamans. Like you yourself are a shaman, and so am I now, because we're reconnecting all this that has been lost with the present, or we're trying to explain it to people in terms that they can understand what happened with this loss of connection to nature, why we lost the feeling of the sacredness of nature. That was the most important thing. We lost the sacredness of the planets and the moon and the sun, and the sacredness of the plants and the animals, and all the life and the rhythm of nature, the four seasons. All that went, really. Some of the ceremonies the church took over, but on the whole, they lost the ancient shamanic ceremonies that the Druids had, for instance, all over Europe. The Druids before Christianity were very, very developed, highly developed culture, who knew a great deal about connection with all these things and who practiced it. And the Cathedral of Chartres today is the memory, if you like. It's the last citadel of the shamanic tradition in Europe, because Chartres itself was the place where all the shamans of Europe came together for certain ceremonies. And I've just been involved with this because I've been many times to Chartres and done many talks there. So all this is coming together now, because this is the time when we're really faced with the karmic effects of what we've done over the last 2,000 years. And this is a tremendous, confrontation, really, to have to admit that we were wrong in so many ways and to try and put it right in as much as we can, as quickly as we can, both, first of all, in relation to nature, secondly, in relation to all the indigenous people that we've injured, and thirdly, in relation to the Black people who are now rising to claim their right to be recognized as human, really. And unfortunately, Christians thought of other races and species as non-human, below them, because they were a different color, they were below, they were insignificant, they were expendable. So all this is a trauma, very, very powerful, deep trauma, which needs to be healed, and which I'm now engaged with other shamans in different cultures in trying to heal. I would love to have a great mass, a Catholic mass for the dead. This weekend is really the celebration of the departed, the lives of the departed. There ought to be a great ceremony all over the world, all the churches coming together, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, anything else really, Hindu, Buddhist, to mourn the lives that have been lost through our ignorance, not sin, but ignorance, because we simply didn't know what we were doing. And the church thought that it had the right to do what it was doing, and that it was correct in doing God's will, it thought, to conquer the lands in the name of Christ, in the name of God, and then take over the lands and the property and the customs and everything of the indigenous peoples everywhere, and just change them into what they thought what ought to be rather than what was. So it's a long, long history, and certainly the last 500 or 600 years have been the worst of it. But it started right at the beginning in the destruction of the pagan temples and all the wonderful works of art and the great library of Alexandria, things like that, which were destroyed quite deliberately by the Christian churches or Christian individuals who were fanatical in their desire to have Christianity supreme and no trace of the previous religions and previous worship existing anymore. So I probably said enough about that. Would you like to ask me anything else about that?
Yes, well, it's something you mentioned in your talk Awakening to a New Story as well, it seems that perhaps the mystical core of Christianity, or perhaps mysticism more broadly, and this shamanic tradition which you're talking about, it seems like that survived the centuries in different forms, but perhaps underground, perhaps in a kind of secretive way, because of everything you've spoken about, because of the hegemony, the fanaticism of the church. It wasn't a culture in which connection to our hearts, connection to our nature, this is what Jung speaks of as part of our relationship to nature, is a relationship to our own nature, to the feelings of our heart, to our affections, to our imaginations, our intuitions, etc. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about the degree to which the mystical core had survived the centuries, because as you just mentioned, the sins of Christianity, a lot of it came from a deviation from Christ's teaching, and in that way we can see Christ as a mystic, and the shamans as mystics, and the alchemists, and different teachers through the centuries. And yeah, I wonder, do you think that has endured to our present day, and could it be reborn and reinvigorated in certain ways? I suppose that's one question, and then I had another, perhaps as a separate point, the effect science really has had on our perspectives and the desouling of nature.
Okay, well, I think I can answer them together, because you're right about the tradition. The mystical tradition came from Egypt originally, from the great Egyptian teachers. Then it was passed to the pre-Socratic Greeks like Parmenides, and they get a wonderful book to get on that is In the Dark Places of Wisdom by Peter Kingsley. That will tell you all you need to know about the shamanic tradition in pre-Socratic Greece. And then it was passed on through various individuals in different cultures and different places in the Muslim world as well, because their mystics were persecuted just like the Christian mystics were persecuted. But there were very great ones, like somebody called Sohrawardi, for instance, was a marvelous teacher, and he was murdered. So this tradition of murdering anybody who challenged the orthodox position goes through all the religious traditions, except possibly Buddhism. It's in Hinduism as well, but not so much. And what happened was, it came into the Christian tradition. For instance, there were great medieval mystics. Roger Bacon was one of them. Abelard was another, and there were others whose names I can't remember. But then you come to Dante, for instance, was an extraordinary mystic, and St. Francis, a little bit before him. And St. Francis was trying to restore the true teaching of the church, the message of Christ, which was about loving one's neighbor, looking after the poor, connecting with animals. He had wonderful conversations with the wolf, as well as the birds. He shook the wolf by the paw and said, "Now, wolf, you're not to go around killing any more people." And the wolf said yes. It's a legend anyway. But it's a wonderful story, but it shows the shamanic tradition, because he was a shaman, St. Francis. And that goes on right the way through. You won't hear them all, but St. Bonaventura was a wonderful man. Then you come to the later mystics, Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, and any number of them really. But they had to be very, very careful. St. Teresa had to be terribly careful, and so did St. John of the Cross, because they would have been pounced on. And Meister Eckhart was one of the greatest mystics, who again was a shaman, and who was teaching exactly the same thing as I put into my talk, that we are all divine in our essence, so to speak, and that God is present within us as well as all around us. So this is the secret tradition, and the alchemists had to go underground again. The alchemists, there were, I think, between 4,000 and 6,000 alchemists working in Europe between 1200 and 1600. And that's in my chapter in my book on alchemy. So there was an enormous number of people ostensibly looking for gold, but really looking for the treasure of connection with the divine ground. And they had to be very careful, as I said. And a wonderful man called Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake in 1600 because he said that God was present in nature. So that's what you were up against with the church. That's after Galileo, 1600, that's a little way after Galileo. So you had to be very, very careful. And he tried to defend himself, but they simply wouldn't listen. And that was the end. That was the end of him, so to speak. I never forget that. I've always felt very close to that man. And so there was him. And then as you begin to, and meanwhile, there were all the witch trials and the witch burnings, all the women who had the skills of healing and midwifery and herbal knowledge, they were wiped out over 4 or 5 centuries. And also it was rather like when the people are told now to inform if they see somebody gathering together where they shouldn't be. It was that sort of atmosphere, only 1,000 times worse, of informing on your neighbor. So lots of people got arrested or indicted for doing things that all they were doing probably was watering their herbs or something like that. You had to be so careful what you did all those centuries. And then in the 17th century, there was something called the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which was a very important movement, which again tried to restore all these teachings. And it too got wiped out by the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire in Austria together. They put it down. They just made it impossible for people to speak, because it was the time in the 17th century. So it's coming up now because with great difficulty, because to come to the scientific thing, if you have a philosophy which says that the universe is without meaning or intelligence or existence almost in the way we're speaking about, you kill out the mystical vision. You absolutely stamp it out as if you were stamping out a fire. So it's very difficult. You can read the paper people lead is totally bereft of any insight into a deeper level. It's entirely extrovert and it's entirely superficial, except when people comment about the tragedies they've experienced. Then they touch on it, perhaps. But even then, there's no discussion of survival of the soul. There's no discussion about the existence of the soul. All that is taboo. So to bring this knowledge back into consciousness, I'm trying to do it, and there are other people in the Scientific Medical Network doing it, and there are other groups all over the world in different traditions who are doing it. In India, you always have great gurus teaching still, despite the dreadful Hinduism, what do you call it, nationalistic Hinduism, which is taking hold of it now. You know, if you look below the surface, you can find it. You'll find it in China as well, although it would be very, very carefully hidden there because it goes against the whole communist tradition. So you're up against it, and you have to just live your own life as you're doing, bringing people together who are interested in the ideas that you're teaching. You're not being persecuted. You're not being ridiculed by scientists because you haven't got any of that kind of person in your group, probably. So you're secure in what you're doing, what you're teaching, and the people listening to you are secure because they're interested in what you have to express and what you have to convey. And that's a wonderful gift. This is the Holy Spirit, which nobody knows anything about either, because that's another whole kettle of fish. Because the Holy Spirit was always feminine until something called the Council of Nicaea in 325 under the Emperor Constantine, when it became male. And it probably became male because the Latin spiritus sanctus is a male noun. So the word for pneuma, the Greek word, was neuter, could be both. And then the Hebrew word was ruach, which was feminine. So you have perhaps a gender change just through.
And it's a dove, and the symbol's a dove.
Yeah. And so that happened. And then from then on, 325 on, we've had the Holy Spirit as male. And the poor feminine aspect of the Holy Spirit has been banished. And I'll send you a recent talk, much shorter than the one I gave, which is about when the feminine principle was lost, which was as early as 621 BCE. Shall I just go on with that?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what happened then was that a group of priests called Deuteronomists took over the first temple in Jerusalem, and they got rid of the goddess, because the goddess Asherah was married to Yahweh, or was the consort of Yahweh, and with Yahweh was the creator of the world. So there you have the male and the female together bringing the world into being. So they got rid of the goddess by throwing out a statue from the temple, throwing out the brass serpent, which was the symbol of her power to regenerate life, which was the old shamanic tradition, and getting rid of all the priests who were in communion with the Holy Spirit in the Holy of Holies, and getting rid of all statues and images of the goddess, and making her anathema, really. No mention of the goddess was allowed henceforth. So the Jews were deprived of the feminine principle in 621 BC, and that got passed on naturally to Christianity, who took over the Old Testament image of God, where there is mention in the book of Proverbs and in the book of Ben Sirach. There's the mention of the Holy Spirit as feminine, but of course they ignored that and just stuck to the male image. And so I'm planning a book with somebody in America on this whole thing, a very light book with pictures and things, rather jokey, sort of saying, well, if God created man and woman in the beginning in his and her own image, presumably, that's why we're male and female. And God must have been male and female in the beginning, or that principle must have been present in the Godhead to have us created male and female. We can make a joke of it that way. And then the Christian priests said, well, what are we going to do with this woman? We'll just get rid of her, and we'll just keep the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit as male. And that settles it. And we'll have the creed said in that way. And from now on, nobody will know what has happened. And we can just proceed as we want. It's quite funny, really, when you look at it all. But it was not funny living in the times when you were hauled up for the Inquisition and murdered, really. So, and the science side of things, I don't know when science is going to change, but it is changing. And one or two of the people that I quoted in that talk, for instance, Ibn Alexander, the surgeon who had that extraordinary near-death experience, or really died and came back, he's going strong in teaching this new format, or these new ideas, really. And there are many other scientists as well, like Amit Goswami is another one. And even Max Planck said that about mind being spirit. Can't remember his actual quote, but it's coming up. And David Bohm, who's a great physicist, he was saying that the two orders of reality. And you can see a marvelous talk of his on YouTube, I think. I haven't been able to watch it. Have you watched?
Yes, I've seen that. Yeah, everyone should definitely, everyone watching this should definitely check that out. He was
another heretic from a science point of view.
Yes.
And he got persecuted. And all his great gifts, he had terrible depressions that he struggled with because of the rejection. So mystics, he wasn't really a mystic. He was a brilliant physicist who had the mystical vision in the old sense. But it just shows what can happen recently. And for instance, with what's the name of the great scientist who died, who was so crippled?
Stephen Hawking.
Stephen Hawking. Well, I often wonder what happened to Stephen Hawking. He wasn't dead, because he was absolutely convinced that there's no survival of any sort. And he's very powerful influence. And people believed what he said, and instead of finding out for themselves, they just believe what they're told again. So science has a long way to go, but the wall may crumble very quickly, rather like the Berlin Wall. I think it can come down very quickly. It just needs one huge breakthrough push. And the Scientific and Medical Network has something called the Galileo Commission, which is all the scientists who are open to this new way of thinking.
Oh, wow.
Have you heard of that?
Haven't.
Well, you should, I
I'll
think,
check that out.
join the Scientific and Medical Network, because it would give you access to this, or put in Galileo Commission into Google and see what comes up.
Mm-hmm.
Because they've got together and they've said enough is enough, and we will just gently introduce the idea that there is a different way of looking at reality, and that the universe is conscious, and that our consciousness comes from that consciousness, does not begin in the brain.
Yes, I think with science, a paradigm is definitely shifting, and the much talked about element of it is the quantum theory with the that we can't eliminate the observing the mind or the consciousness that observes at the quantum level, and
exactly.
I think that's something that science has to deal with, and I think there's it has to awaken to the fact that the scientific effort is nested in consciousness first and foremost.
Well, you're absolutely right, but I think it is happening, and I think the quantum physics is doing it because it's upset everything. Everything has to be thought of anew. It's really like a new revelation. I think I said that in my talk. It is a revelation, and it's a new concept of God for those who believe in God, because God is not separate outside anymore, but is the process itself, is consciousness itself.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, Anne, as you've been speaking, some of the language that you've used in your talks has been the lunar era, the solar era, and the stellar era, as a description of how consciousness evolves. And I wonder what your thoughts are on where we're at now. And what I mean by that is a lot of what you've said about the repressive aspect of Christianity and other traditions is associated to the dominance of the solar era, as I understand it from what you've said. And something that strikes me is that the fact that you and I can have a conversation like this wouldn't have been the case years ago. The freedom with which individuals, people can follow their hearts and their intuitions and different forms of knowledge and communicate and learn and all of these things. It seems that the cultural moment which we're in is less repressive than those earlier eras in many respects, and so and to me that gives me hope of a kind of shifting consciousness towards which these mystical ideas, this mystical tradition, can be reconnected with and brought back to life in many ways. And I think a lot of that has to do with you and I and people watching and the consciousness of individuals transforming. So I suppose my question is, how do you see our current moment in relationship to that? And what do you mean by the stellar era, and how is that different from the solar era? And I hope those questions make sense, because it seems to me that the culture we're in now is very different than, say, Tudor England, where, or as you were saying about the repression of certain mystical ideas, often very violently. Seems that we live in a culture that's much more open in some respects, and I wonder if that represents a transition in consciousness, a greater expansion of our ability to explore our potentials and who we are as human beings?
Well, I think there are two things here. First of all, there's the internet, which has brought us all into touch with each other. That's an enormous change because
Yes.
people can speak freely, people can connect with people in any country in the world at the same time if they want, America, South America, China, India, whatever. So that is a huge step forward because it's enabling this shift in consciousness to take place. It's a facilitator, if you like. I mean, there's a lot of the dark web as well. That comes in too because the shadow is always present. But I think that's number one thing. Secondly, climate change, that's going to be an accelerator because we're all going to have to adapt pretty quickly to that within the next 10 years. If we leave it to 20, 30 years, we're going to be finished as a species, possibly. So there's a sense of urgency in the need to change our awareness of how we've treated nature in the past and how we need to treat it in the future. With David Attenborough telling us what to do and what not to do. So those are the two vital changes, I think. And the expression stellar consciousness comes from the alchemists because it means reconnecting with the stars consciously. And in fact, there are a lot of people, I get things practically every week from somebody called Portal to Ascension, which gives many different talks on this very subject of connecting with extraterrestrial beings who are trying to help the Earth get through this very difficult phase, because we're not through it yet. We're on the cusp or on the watershed, if you like, between two different forms of consciousness or two different kinds of awareness of what reality is. One is the solar era that I've described, which was all about power and success and competition, and the warrior being supreme. Look at the warriors we've got in the leaders now in China, in Russia, in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran. They're all warrior leaders. Still, they haven't got the message that they have to change. So I was thinking this morning, how do we get rid of these warrior leaders who are still competing with each other for power? So that's another thing, that's a third thing, but I hope the next generation of leaders won't be like the present one. But it's very, very worrying that, whereas you can see in Europe, the leaders have moved on a step. They're no longer, because possibly the European Union and the ideas behind it, they're no longer fighting each other in competition. But now they have to deal with the Muslim crisis, where the shadow is coming up in the form of the old warrior ethos, wanting to take over the world, wanting to kill, wanting to get rid of any rivals. Same old theme, really. So that's the thing that we have to face, which is very difficult for the leaders, like Macron in France. It's a very difficult situation with a huge Muslim population. Many of which have no interest in this new ideology at all, but they're stuck with the Muslim label, being tarred with the same brush. So all these different elements are coming together, and there will be a tremendous period of conflict, I think. It would help if science could move and get its act together with quantum physics and understand that it's been wrong for 300 years in teaching this materialist philosophy. That would help a lot. Because people now are taking their lives, thinking that their lives have no value, because they only have the cultural sort of ethos of, if you don't succeed, you're no use, so you might as well give up. If you're not rich, if you're not famous, if you're not a celebrity, you're nobody, and your life has no meaning. And they kill themselves because of that. And it's very, very tragic, because there's nothing in the culture. There's no Christianity anymore, because Christianity doesn't dare speak up. And anyway, if it did speak up, it probably wouldn't say the right things of going back to the beginning and to the actual teaching of Christ and to the divinity that we carry within us, because it doesn't know about it. So what is there to help people through this very difficult period? The old ethos of Christianity was forgiving your neighbor, forgiving your enemy, and helping your neighbor. That was the two things that did come through. And there's a huge amount done by Christians all through the centuries to help other people and to help the poor and suffering. And medicine really came out of that. The whole medical thing, together with science, came out of that desire to help people, to improve people's lives. And that's a very Christian idea, and that could be restored and recovered if people thought about it. So it's an important era that we're living in, but as I say, it's an in-between era. The old values are going, and the new ones haven't been clearly formulated yet, which are about caring for the earth and caring for each other, no matter what our color, race, or creed. Those are the two primary values of a new era. And obviously looking after the animals and the life of the planet and the seas, the oceans, and doing what we can to mitigate the damage that we've caused, the amount of harm we've caused to the earth, and really sincerely regret it and do something to change. So there are many, many ideas. I mean, Extinction Rebellion is one aspect of this, and there are other ones all over the world, and different groups are working to bring this forward, some with the indigenous people, some. I have a great friend called Cilla Elworthy who's written a book called The Business Plan for Peace. She's been very active in the nuclear area for 30 years, and she's put forward this plan whereby a certain amount of money could eliminate all the conflicts in the world and the suffering in the world. All the money that's now going into nuclear weapons and new weapons of destruction could be harnessed to actually healing the terrible wounds of humanity. So she's doing a lot, and there are people like her who are not particularly well known, but who are doing a great deal in other cultures. I have two friends in Geneva who are doing a tremendous amount, working with young people in Africa and Egypt. So there's a lot going on, and everything. But we can just do what you're doing and teaching what you know, passing it on, drawing people together who have the same interests. And one doesn't have to call it mystical. I would call it the, I don't know what you'll have to think of a term yourself, I think, but not necessarily mystical, because that may put people off. It's really to do, I know what you call it, the wisdom tradition. That's what it was always called. The wisdom tradition, and to bring back wisdom into our culture is one of the necessities now, wherever one can promote it or find it or use it to heal traumas.
Yes, wisdom, I think, is a theme here, especially in a world of seemingly limitless information and knowledge and all of these things. What are we to do with that? What are we to make of that? And how are we to organize our lives and our relationships, and how are we to live? And I think that that emphasis on wisdom is tremendously important. Perhaps the kind of last thing I wanted to touch on was the role of imagination in all of this, because it seems to me that connected to everything you've said is a kind of dearth of, or absence of, or lack of imagination in certain ways. It seems that, for example, the solar era you talk about would be predicated on a notion of separation, like, for instance, the separation of spirit and nature. And it seems to me that's a failure of imagination, a failure of vision, to see the world in terms of deep divisions in that way. And I think this is connected too with our epistemology, maybe, with the science that's kind of in the air, and the wanting to categorize and box up different things in different ways. I feel that can have a kind of fragmenting effect on our consciousness, and just to see the world as separation, in terms of separation. And my sense is that what is needed is to transcend that, and as you've really beautifully pointed to, there's a whole tradition of seeing the world in terms of unity, in terms of unity between the masculine and the feminine, and in terms of the harmony that can be achieved there. Yeah, I suppose, I don't know exactly what the question is, but it's the lunar cultures you talk of, the really ancient shamanic ways of seeing, what the Greeks were doing at Eleusis. All of this, the more I look at it, I feel is palpably absent in a lot of our culture. The sense of vision, the sense of seeing beyond mere materiality, etc. And connecting to our heart and connecting to our imagination. I feel when you use the word wisdom, from everything that I've read of what Jung wrote about the anima, to me, a deep sense of what the word wisdom means is the listening to our heart, is the best way I can put it, listening to what's coming through from the imagination. And I feel that, as you've mentioned about science, about suicides, etc., about how people can become disenchanted with the kind of worldview around them, I think a lot of that is to do with losing connection to the heart, and that also seems connected to a lot of your work. I'm reading your The Myth of the Goddess at the moment. It seems all of that's connected. That if we're out of tune with our heart and our imagination, that is connected to being out of tune with the feminine aspect of divinity. And so, yeah, I suppose I'd offer that and see what your thoughts are. But I suppose that's part of the emerging consciousness. To me, it seems like it has to be a remembering or a bringing in maybe a remembering is the best word of this lunar consciousness and of the heart and of the imagination.
You're right. You put it very well, and I think I told you about reading McGilchrist, which you've probably done, but it's reconnecting with the right hemisphere, because we've been programmed, McGilchrist says, too long through the left hemisphere. We've had too much emphasis on the mind, on logic, on reason, on not accepting what is outside the parameters set by science. And this is only because science is just too narrow. It doesn't know how big it can grow yet. It doesn't know that it hasn't got the instruments yet to penetrate to the heart of dark matter, for instance. It doesn't know. We only know about 4 or 5%. We see 4 or 5% of what exists. So there's all 95% that we don't know about yet, and we can't penetrate. So this is where the imagination can function. And I think the way children, some children now are being brought up, now being taken out into the woods and into the gardens and things where they can touch things, where they can learn through touch, learn through seeing, learn through feeling, rather than learning through books or what they're taught in schools. And this is very good. This is very positive. So when those children grow up, they'll already have that imaginative function much better in action than, say, their mothers and fathers had. And I happen to have a mother who was absolutely in the imagination, and she was a mystic. So I was extremely lucky. But I also had a patriarchal father, and there was a tremendous conflict between them, because the patriarchal father was terrified of this mystical mother. And there were, various complexes there, which I inherited. So the reason I've concentrated on the feminine is really because I was trying to rescue my mother when I was a child and couldn't do so. And that's been carried on into my working life. So the imagination was allowed to develop because I didn't have anyone preventing it. My father loved me very much and paid for me to go to Oxford and everything, but he was just uncomprehending of this other side of life. He could not understand what my mother was going on about. And she couldn't understand why he couldn't understand. So, I mean, this is the conflict now with a very materialistic culture, and with people in it like you and me who are lifting, as it were, trying to lift the leaven in the bread, lift the whole loaf through the leaven we're providing. But it's going to take time. And I think Jung said it might take 500 years, which hopefully not, because I don't think humanity will be around if it doesn't change. But it's when the embryo is born, the right hemisphere of the brain is the first to develop. And the left hemisphere comes in several months later or even a year later. So if the right hemisphere and the heart connection isn't a good one, owing to good mothering and good bonding with the infant, you won't have that connection from childhood on. It'll be missing. And this is one of the things that I think our whole culture, in the way mothers have been treated, and not enough time in hospital and bundled out of the maternity ward before they're barely given birth, that sort of thing. There's no time to assimilate the relationship with the baby. And so that I would say midwifery is one of the huge things that need changing. Secondly, the education of young children, primary school. And finally, secondary education, where these subjects can come up to be discussed. What is the meaning of life? Why am I here on this planet? Who put me here? Those sort of questions, which shouldn't be squashed down and ridiculed, but encouraged by the teacher to have the people listen to the children who are asking these questions. And then when they get to university, again, I had to fight. In my university days, I was offered to read whether I was going to do history or literature, and I chose history because I wanted to know the past, and I wasn't so interested in one small batch of knowledge. I wanted to have the whole width of exploration, and they accepted that. They accepted that I should read history. But I had quite a struggle with the tutors who were very scientifically minded and who were trying to get me through the final exam, etc., and therefore had to keep me on the straight and narrow. I couldn't go wandering off wherever I wanted. I had to keep within the scholarly framework, which was very good for my mind. But the imagination came out when I went to the Far East and India, and I saw these other civilizations utterly different from my own, which I'd never dreamed of in what I'd learned in Oxford. So through experience in life, the imagination was awakened to view the incredible beauty of these civilizations, the incredible works of art, and the great temples, and the beauty of the people in India, particularly with their wonderful saris and turbans and things. And the beauty of the landscape was utterly magnificent, seeing the Himalayas in the distance, gleaming far, far up above where you could see them normally, sort of thing. So all that was opening to the imagination in my life. And I'm sure you must have had something like that in yours in order to be able to value the imagination. But it's a question of nourishing children, the feelings of children, so that they trust their feelings and don't repress them, and are allowed to follow them in whatever ways that they exhibit that need to be followed. And particularly during adolescence, that they're taken to places to see things of great beauty and experience things which really move them. It could be music, it could be art, it could be literature, it could be animals. Anything which touches the heart is what's good to follow.
Yes, as you've been speaking, two images came up. One is I've been exploring this a bit in my work recently. The image of in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the child catcher, and also in Peter Pan, Captain Hook. To me, both of those are kind of contemporary images in our imagination of this repressive attitude towards the child and towards that childlike, open-hearted, imaginative, engaged consciousness. And to me, I've been looking at a lot at the image of Saturn, and you've talked about the alchemists understood lead to be the terrestrial manifestation of Saturn, and so that attitude towards that childlike open-heartedness is, well, it seems to me like it to be an archetype, or some kind of perennial pattern, or something that it's good to be aware of in our culture, and in order to transform it. And the other thing that came to mind was something Jesus said, which was, until you become as a child, you will not enter the kingdom. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, those were two of the images that came to mind as you were talking. I think a sense of preserving that childlike engagement with the world through life seems to me to be something central and powerful. And I think materialism in particular, the zeitgeist, the spirit of our times, things like that can really kind of seduce us into thinking in terms of very narrow categories. And I think that is a form of what you call the one-eyed consciousness. It's a form of losing one of our eyes, and that all seems to be clustered around the alchemical image of the leadened consciousness and the Saturnine consciousness, and we're seeing as a child, as Jesus says, we become as a child to enter the kingdom. It feels to me like we were all. That's an ancient memory for all of us, or it's a memory in our past for all of us. That we're walking through the woods, playing games with our friends, really being at one in a sense with our intuitions and the enchantment of nature and the world. And to me, there's a core there that we all have, a memory that we all have, and it's
I think that's what the program Autumn Watch or Spring Watch is trying to bring back, because they have a great love of nature and a great knowledge of nature, and they can really take the audience, probably with many, many children, into an awareness of what the birds are doing, what the stags are doing, what the fish are doing. They can make people more aware of what's happening all around them without necessarily living in a place where these things are. So that's very important, I think. That's something new, which is very good. And of course, they're all David Attenborough's programs as well. And one can see that this divine element in us is precisely that imagination, I think, that you're so interested in. It's to activate that and to trust it and not to ridicule it or stamp it out, but it's like a little tiny candle flame which has to be nourished and allowed to grow, so to speak. But if you snuff it out too soon in life, you may lose it forever. And then it turns into, Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, if you bring forth what is within you will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you will destroy you. That's a very subtle and profound saying. So if you kill this imagination, if you kill this divine flame, it turns into bitterness, rage, hatred, and then is expressed in all the problems that we have with society. But it's really the suffering soul is crying out in all the crimes that we have for having been snuffed out.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful place to conclude. I think I suppose I wanted to say as well, I really appreciate your work, Anne. I think everything you're speaking from a place of tremendous depth and insight, and I think it's so important, the work you're doing. I think the understanding of earlier forms of consciousness, the understanding of our history and how things have come to where we're at the moment, and how we might move forward. I find it all tremendously helpful and wise, and I really value it and would really recommend to anyone watching to go and check out your work and to engage with it, because it's really profound.
Well, thank you, Sam, and I'm very happy to meet with you whenever you want, or with your group, because I'm a teacher, and I don't want to pass on. I'm going to be 89 next month, so I want to pass on as much as I can while I'm still here, while I'm still able to think and my mind hasn't gone. My heart is still strong. So just feel that perfectly free to contact me when you want. And it's a pleasure to talk to you and to speak to somebody who understands what I'm teaching and what I've been saying. So thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Okay.
Cool. I appreciate it. Let's keep in touch and hopefully speak again soon.
Okay, I'll say goodbye now then.
Goodbye, Anne.
Bye.